We obey laws written by dead kings, and we speak languages shaped by poets who have been dust for centuries. But there is one ghost that is more powerful than all the others. A ghost that we still carry in our pockets. A ghost that still decides who eats and who starves. This is the story of the Maria Theresa Thaler. It is a coin that shouldn't exist. Technically, it is a forgery. A coin dated 1780 that was minted in 1950. A currency from an empire that collapsed 100 years ago. That was used to buy coffee in Yemen yesterday. Why? Because we have a problem with trust. The modern world tells you that value is a number on a screen. It tells you that wealth is a promise made by a central bank. But history remembers what happens to promises. Promises break. Banks fail. Empires crumble into the sea. In the geography of the void, those places where the law is thin and the desert is wide, they don't trust the living. They trust the Empress. They trust a woman who has been dead for 2 centuries because she is the only thing in this world that never changes her mind. She is the 23.389 grams of truth. In this documentary, The Ghost Coins, we are going to travel into the cracks of history. We are going to follow the silver from the frozen mints of Vienna to the sun-scorched ports of the Red Sea. We are going to see how the world's greatest empires tried to kill this ghost and how they all failed. Because you can't kill a memory, and you can't devalue the dead. Welcome to Vellum and Void. Let us begin at the moment time stopped. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Ledger. The scratch of quill on parchment. A clerk in Vienna, November 1780. He writes the date at the top of the ledger, the same date he's written for months, the same date he'll write for the next 200 years. Change it, not because of some bureaucratic error, but because on November 29th of that year, Maria Theresa died. And with her death, time itself stopped. At least, it stopped on a coin. You have to understand something about Maria Theresa. She wasn't beloved because she was gentle. She was beloved because she was relentless. For 40 years, she held together an empire that had no right to exist. Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, pieces of Poland. All stitched together by marriages, treaties, and the sheer force of her will. And when she needed money to fight wars, to pay soldiers, to keep the whole impossible thing from flying apart, she didn't debase the currency like everyone else did. She kept it honest. 23.389 grams of silver. Not 23.3, not 23.4, 23.389. That number, that precision, it became a promise. Not a promise from Austria, a promise from her. The Günzburg Mint, the Hall Mint. These weren't just buildings. They were places where silver became trust, where metal became memory. The coin itself, the Maria Theresa Thaler, it wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. Her portrait on the front, stern, aging, wearing the veil of a widow. No attempt to flatter. The Habsburg eagle on the back, wings spread, clutching sword and scepter. It looked like authority. It felt like permanence. But there was something about the weight of it. The edge milling, those tiny ridges you could feel with your thumb in the dark. The way it rang when you dropped it on marble. A specific pitch. A specific song. Merchants learn that song, the way a musician learns perfect pitch. The coin was meant for trade with the Ottoman Empire. Venice to Constantinople, Alexandria to Aleppo. It traveled the old routes, the ones that had been there since Rome fell, the ones that would outlive everyone. And here's what's strange. The Ottoman sultans, they debased their own currency constantly. War after war after war, they needed money, so they added copper to the silver, made each coin worth a little less, until no one trusted them anymore. The French did the same, the Spanish, even the British eventually. But Maria Theresa, she never did. And when she died, the coin died with her. Except it didn't. November 29th, 1780, they found her in her bed, 63 years old, 40 years as Empress. Her son Joseph became emperor. He reformed everything, changed everything, except the coin, because the merchants wouldn't accept anything else. Traders in Jeddah, in Aden, in Zanzibar, and Addis Ababa, they didn't care about Joseph. They didn't care about the politics of Vienna. They cared about 23.389 grams. And they told the mints, keep the date, keep her face, keep everything exactly as it was. So the mints did. Year after year, decade after decade. 1790, still minting 1780. 1800, still minting 1780. 1850, still minting 1780. 1900, still minting 1780. The French Revolution came and went. Napoleon rose and fell. Austria-Hungary itself collapsed after World War I. But the coin kept being struck, same date, same face, same eagle. Imagine, you're a merchant in Yemen in 1935. You're holding a coin that says 1780. That's 155 years ago. But the coin in your hand, it was minted last month, in Vienna, by a government that technically doesn't exist anymore. And yet, you trust it. More than you trust British pounds, more than you trust French francs. Because the living, they change their minds, they lie, but the dead are honest. It was a citizen of nowhere. It belonged to the void, to the places between empires, between laws, between times. They didn't need Maria Theresa to be alive. They needed her to be unchanging. And she was, in the silver, in the weight, in the date that never moved forward. Took the year the Empress died, the year that never ended, the year that became eternal. Chapter 2. The Weight of Trust. There's a coldness to silver, a specific heavy temperature that paper can never replicate. To a merchant in the 19th century, holding a Maria Theresa Thaler wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a sensory anchoring. In the grand marbled halls of London or Paris, the world was moving toward paper, elegant slips of ink and promise. But as you moved further from the centers of power into the dust of the Levant, the heat of the Red Sea, or the high, thin air of Ethiopia, those promises began to feel thin, like smoke. The people of the void knew a fundamental truth. A government's word is only as good as its lifespan. And governments, they are fragile things. They are born in revolution, and they die in debt. They change their flags, they rename their cities, and they rewrite their laws. But silver is eternal. It does not care who sits on the throne. It does not care about treaties or telegrams. It only cares about its own purity. Trust in these places was a physical act. It began with the thumb. If you look closely at the Empress on the coin, she wears a brooch on her shoulder. On that brooch, there are tiny raised silver dots, 9 of them. The merchants called them pearls. In a dark stall, lit only by a flickering oil lamp, a trader wouldn't even look at the coin. he would run his thumb over that shoulder. He was looking for the texture of truth. If he felt the 9 pearls, if he felt the specific sharp ridges of the edge milling, the deal could continue. If the shoulder was smooth, the coin was a lie, a copper core disguised with a silver wash. And a lie in the desert could be fatal. You could not eat a lie. You could not buy passage across a mountain range with a lie. Then came the song. Every metal has a voice. Lead is a dull thud. Copper is a harsh tinny clang. But high purity silver, 23.389 grams of it, it sings. When dropped on a stone counter or a marble floor, the Maria Theresa Thaler produces a sustained crystalline ring, a specific pitch that echoed through the bazaars. To hear that sound was to hear the truth. It was a frequency of honesty. For a merchant in 1850, that sound was more reliable than any bank statement in the world. The European empires found this infuriating. The British brought their sovereigns, the Italians brought their lyre, the French brought their francs. They arrived with their uniforms and their steamships, and they explained with great arrogance that their paper was backed by the might of navies and the gold of central banks. The merchants simply listened, and then they asked for the ghost. They rejected the modern world because they understood a paradox that we have forgotten. That modern money requires you to trust a stranger. You must trust a politician you've never met, in a city you've never seen, to keep a promise he might not be able to afford 10 years from now. But the thaler? It required no trust in the living. If the Austrian Empire fell, and it did, the silver was still silver. If the Empress was dead, and she was, the weight was still the weight. It was a currency that functioned perfectly because it had no master. It was the only thing in the world that was truly neutral. In Ethiopia, the coin became something even deeper than money. It became a sacrament. It was used to pay for dowries. It was sewn into the clothing of brides to ensure fertility and wealth. It was used as a standard of measurement. If a bag of grain weighed exactly 10 thalers on a balance scale, then the deal was fair. The coin wasn't just buying the goods. It was the ruler of the world's value. Imagine the frustration of a British colonial officer in the year 1900 trying to buy supplies for his troops. He offers gold. He offers paper. The local chieftain shakes his head. He points to a leather pouch. The fat lady, he says. He wants the Empress. The officer is forced to send a telegram all the way back to London, who then has to contact Vienna to buy silver coins dated 1780, just so a British army can eat in the year 1900. The dead were holding the living hostage. We live in an age of digital numbers, pixels on a screen. We are told that value is whatever the system says it is. But there is a part of the human soul that still craves the weight. We want to know that if the lights go out, if the banks close, if the government vanishes, that what we have in our hands is still real. The merchants of the Red Sea weren't backward. They were prophetic. They saw that the world was built on a foundation of paper and air, and they chose to stand on silver. They chose a ghost because a ghost cannot lie to you. But trust is a dangerous thing to leave unattended. And soon, other ghosts would begin to appear. Men who didn't want to use the silver for trade, but for war. In our next chapter, we follow the coin into the most dangerous places on Earth, the no man's lands, where the ghost coins became the only law left standing. we go to the geography of the void. Chapter 3. The geography of the void. History is usually written by the victors, and the victors always draw lines. Borders, jurisdictions, empires. We are taught that the world is a solid puzzle of colored shapes, each owned by someone, each governed by a set of laws. But the Maria Theresa Thaler didn't live on the shapes. It lived in the cracks. It was a currency that sought out the geography of the void, those strange forgotten pockets of the earth where the maps were blurry and the law was a suggestion. Those places where the authority of a king or a president felt as distant as the stars. Think of a place called Neutral Morisnet, a tiny triangular sliver of land no larger than a few square miles, tucked between Belgium and Prussia. In the mid-19th century, after the fall of Napoleon, neither side could agree on who owned it. It contained a valuable zinc mine, and neither empire was willing to let the other have it. So, for nearly 100 years, this little triangle simply existed. It had no king. It had no flag. It had no official army. It was a glitch in the matrix of Europe. In Morisnet, life was strange. The people didn't want the Belgian franc, and they didn't want the Prussian thaler. They didn't want to be tied to the shifting politics of Brussels or Berlin. They wanted the ghost. Because in a place that didn't technically exist, only a currency from an empire that no longer existed made any sense. It was a match made in the shadows. The Maria Theresa Thaler became the heartbeat of Morisnet. It was the only thing everyone could agree on in a world of no man's lands. But the Thaler's true kingdom was much larger than a mountain triangle in Europe. Its true kingdom was the ocean of sand and the ocean of water. In the empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula, borders were an alien concept. A nomad doesn't care about a line drawn in ink on a desk in London. The Bedouin moved with the seasons, following the water, following the ancient logic of the desert. To them, a British pound or an Ottoman lira was a symbol of shackles. It was the money of the tax collector, the money of the city dweller. But the Maria Theresa Thaler, that was the money of the free. They called it the Abu Kush, the father of the bird, because of the Habsburg eagle on the back. They believed the eagle was a sign of protection. They would sew the coins into their belts. They would melt them down to create heavy, intricate jewelry for their daughters. To the people of the desert, the silver wasn't just value. It was armor. It was a currency that bypassed the state entirely. The Red Sea was the silver's central nervous system. From the port of Aden to the markets of Addis Ababa, the thaler was the only bridge that held the world together. In Ethiopia, the trust was so absolute that the thaler survived the fall of kings. When Emperor Menelik II tried to introduce his own coin, the birr, he was forced to make it look exactly like Maria Theresa. He tried to change the face to his own. He tried to update the date, but the people wouldn't touch it. They looked at the coin, and they saw a politician trying to steal their trust. Menelik eventually had to admit defeat. He realized that in the eyes of his people, he was just a man who might be gone tomorrow. But the woman on the silver, she was a monument. She was the past, and therefore she was safe. The void is a dangerous place for an empire. It is a place where their authority leaks out like water through sand. European diplomats would sit in their offices in London, staring at maps, wondering why their superior currencies were being rejected in favor of an 18th century ghost. They didn't understand that the people in the void didn't want modernity. They didn't want the latest fashion or the newest banking system. They wanted permanence. A British pound can be devalued by a vote in Parliament. A French franc can be wiped out by a revolution in the streets. But the Thaler? It was immune to the fever of the present. It was a piece of the past that had successfully colonized the future. It was the first truly stateless currency. Long before the digital ledgers of today, long before we dreamed of decentralized money, there was a ledger written in silver. A system of value that ignored kings, ignored borders, and ignored time itself. But even ghosts have enemies. In the 1930s, the world's most violent empires decided they no longer wanted to share the void with a dead woman. They saw the power she held over the people they wanted to conquer. They wanted her dyes. They wanted her silver. And they were willing to commit the ultimate forgery to get them. They didn't want to replace the ghost. They wanted to wear it. In our next chapter, we enter the minting wars, where the British, the Italians, and the Nazis fought for control over a dead woman's face. We go to the Counterfeit Empires. Chapter 4. The Counterfeit Empires. By the 1930s, the world was no longer a collection of loose trade routes and blurry borders. The modern world was screaming into existence. Radical ideologies were carving up the map, and for the first time in history, the great powers realized that to control the people, they had to control the ghost. The Maria Theresa Thaler had become a problem for the new dictators. When Benito Mussolini turned his eyes toward Ethiopia, he brought with him a modern army of tanks, planes, and poison gas. But he found himself defeated by a piece of silver. The Ethiopian people refused his Italian lyre. To them, the colorful paper of the fascist state was just that, paper. It had no weight, it had no song. It wasn't the Abu Kush. Mussolini was furious. He was a man who demanded total obedience, yet he could not force a coffee merchant in a dusty village to accept his money. He realized that if he wanted to buy supplies, to pay local informants, or to keep his colonial dream alive, he had to provide the only currency they trusted. He had to become a counterfeiter. But here is the ultimate irony. You cannot simply forge a Maria Theresa Thaler. If the weight is off by a fraction of a gram, the merchants will know. If the silver is too bright or the strike is too clean, the illusion is broken. In 1935, the Italian government did something unprecedented. They went to the Austrian government, the owners of the ghost, and they bought the original dyes. They paid for the right to legally manufacture a dead woman's money. For the next several years, the mints in Rome were churning out millions of coins dated 1780. A modern, industrialized state was dedicating its resources to replicating a relic from the Enlightenment. But Mussolini wasn't the only one. As the clouds of World War II gathered, the British realized they had a crisis on their hands. They needed to move armies through the Middle East and East Africa. They needed to buy the loyalty of tribes and the labor of thousands. And they, too, were met with the same demand. Give us the Empress. The British didn't have the dyes. The Italians wouldn't share them. So the Royal Mint in London did what the British have always done. They improvised. They didn't just forge the coin, they reverse engineered it. They studied the wear patterns. they analyzed the exact silver content, 23.389 grams. Soon, the Royal Mint, the Bombay Mint, and even mints in Paris and Brussels were all locked in a minting war. Every major empire was producing the exact same coin with the exact same date to fund their own side of a global conflict. Imagine the absurdity of it. British soldiers and Italian soldiers killing each other in the desert, yet both were carrying the exact same currency in their pockets. The only thing they could agree on was Maria Theresa. This was the moment the ghost coin truly left the realm of economics and entered the realm of myth. It was no longer a tool of trade. It was the fuel of empire. But there was a price to pay for this mass production. When everyone is a counterfeiter, who is the original? The market began to be flooded with millions of new old coins. For the first time in 150 years, the stability of the thaler was threatened. Yet, the ghost survived. Even as the bombs fell on London and Rome, the silver remained pure. The date remained 1780. It proved that the idea of the coin was stronger than the governments that minted it. The British, the Italians, the French, they were all just temporary caretakers of a trust they didn't create and couldn't destroy. As the war ended, the empires were exhausted. They were bankrupt. Their own currencies were in ruins. But in the bazaars of the Red Sea, the thaler was still king. It had outlived the monarchs, the revolutionaries, and now the dictators. But the world was changing. A new kind of power was rising, one that didn't need silver, one that lived in wires and signals. In our final chapter, we look at the legacy of the ghost coins. We ask if the spirit of Maria Theresa still lives in the digital ledgers of the 21st century. We look at the modern phantoms. Chapter 5. The Modern Phantoms. The machines in the mints eventually went quiet. By the late 20th century, the great minting wars had ended. The world had moved on to credit, to plastic, and to the absolute hegemony of the US dollar. For a moment, it seemed like the ghost of 1780 had finally been laid to rest. In the cities, the Maria Theresa Thaler became a curiosity, a collector's item, a heavy silver reminder of a world that no longer made sense to the modern banker. But the void never truly disappears. It only migrates. If you go to the mountains of Ethiopia today, if you travel to the remote villages of the Hadramaut in Yemen, you will still find them. Tucked away in wooden chests, sewn into the linings of old coats. They are no longer the primary currency of the supermarket or the gas station, but they remain the currency of last resort. When the local paper currency collapses, as it so often does in the wake of civil war or hyperinflation, the ghost rises again. Out come the silver coins, the 23.389 grams of truth that haven't changed since the Enlightenment. Because even now, in the age of satellites and fiber optics, the people in the cracks of the world know that paper is just a story, but silver is a fact. But something even stranger is happening. In the early 21st century, a new group of rebels began to look at the history of the Maria Theresa Thaler. They weren't desert nomads or mountain traders. They were mathematicians, coders, cryptographers. They were looking for a way to create a currency that, like the thaler, had no master. They wanted a stateless sovereign, something that couldn't be devalued by a central bank, something that existed in the void of the internet, beyond the reach of any single government's laws. They didn't use silver. They used math. But the philosophy was the same. They wanted to replace the trust in living politicians with trust in an unchanging, frozen system. Just as the merchants of Aden chose a dead empress because she couldn't lie, the architects of the digital age chose code because it cannot cheat. We're circling back to the beginning. The Maria Theresa Thaler was the first decentralized network. Every coin was a node of value. Every merchant who knew the song of the silver was a validator of the system. It didn't need a headquarters. It didn't need a CEO. It only needed a shared belief in a standard that never moved. As we stand here in the present, looking toward an uncertain future, the lesson of the ghost coins is more relevant than ever. We are told that we are entering a new era, an era of digital transparency. But the more our money becomes invisible, the more it becomes just numbers on a screen, the more we find ourselves craving the weight. There is a reason why people still buy gold. There is a reason why, in times of crisis, we look for things we can hold in our hands. It is the human instinct for permanence. The Maria Theresa Thaler was a 250-year experiment in that instinct. It proved that if you provide people with a truth they can touch, they will defend it against every empire on earth. The Empress is still out there. She is in the silver buried in the sands of the empty quarter. She is in the logic of the blockchain. She is in the refusal of the common person to let the state define what is real. We began this journey at a desk in Vienna in 1780. We ends it in the void, that space where we all must decide what we truly trust. The coins may eventually wear thin. The silver may eventually be melted down. But the idea, the ghost, that is eternal. Value isn't what the government says it is. Value is the memory of honesty. Thank you for walking through the shadows with us. This was Vellum and Void. The year is 1780, and it always will be.